Thanks, Lane. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Megan Eiting. I am currently the Moose Collaborative Planner. I have worked for the DNR for about 16 years in the Division of Forestry. I was actually a field forester out of the Eveleth field station, which is in the Hibbing forestry area, and saw an opportunity to jump on board this project and do something for moose. And so I took it. I've been in this position since last June, June 2023, I should say. So about 18 months now. It is a temporary position, and I'm the project manager for this kind of collaborative effort, looking at trying to do some large scale moose habitat restoration work. So just to start, moose are the iconic Minnesota Northwood species. They're on numerous lakes and roads and towns, and sports teams are named after moose in Minnesota, and more than that, they're a really significant cultural species for the Ojibwe bands that have long been in Minnesota. So they're just a really important species and something that is important to the state. So just to go through some background on moose in Minnesota. So moose have always been in Minnesota, back even as long as pre-settlement, pre-European time for sure. So this is kind of a map of the original ranges of cervids in Minnesota. As you can see up in the northeast corner, they used to be caribou, and then moose in the forested region generally, and then deer and elk kind of on that prairie transition. In the 1800s, it was estimated that moose were present in the forested regions, but they were fairly low in numbers. And then in the early 1900s, the logging boom in Minnesota came with the resulting wildfires, really shifting the Minnesota forest composition from pine, spruce, and fir, conifer dominated, to a lot of aspen, birch, hardwood types, and really a large proportion of young regenerating forests. And this really was more suitable to an increase in moose numbers, and so there was an increase in the early 1900s. However, by the 1920s, overhunting of all cervids in Minnesota had taken place, and so in 1922 the state closed moose hunting statewide, just because of those low moose numbers. At that point, as you can see on the map, the caribou had disappeared from northeastern Minnesota, and moose were expanding north, or retreating north, I should say. And in 1971, there was a limited season that was open, and that was really due to an increase in the population since the 1950s. Again, that young forest and largely hardwood that was on the landscape helped with that. But also at the same time, deer were expanding farther northward. And even in the 1930s, there was brainworm that was observed in moose, and so that interaction between deer and moose did have an impact as well. By 1982, the DNR had established a separate population survey between the Northwest and the Northeast moose population in Minnesota, kind of separating those two. In 1997, due to a significant decline in the population in the Northwest, Northwest Minnesota, they closed hunting for that population. Continuing declining in the Northwest in 2007, and there's the last survey of the population in the Northwest was in 2007, and that was at fewer than 100 animals. So currently, what's considered Minnesota current core moose range is in the northeastern part of the state. Of course, there are moose that are found across northern Minnesota yet, but this is where the population is large enough to be estimated annually, and that's via an aerial survey. Every January, the survey is flown, and from those observations, a estimate is made in the population. So this core moose range is about 3.4 million acres. The red line there is delineating that, and that line, that area really is a from when there was an open hunt in northeastern Minnesota. Those were the hunting zones, and so that line isn't it's really just a kind of a political boundary, an arbitrary line delineating what used to be the hunting zones. As you can see, it's limited to northeastern St. Louis County, Lake County, and Cook County. The moose range falls entirely within the 1854 ceded territory. This is the area that where the three bands in northeastern Minnesota, Boys Fort, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage, still hold treaty rights for hunting and gathering. So continuing, through after the Northwest Minnesota population declined, the Northeast moose population was doing fairly well until starting in 2009. From 2009 to 2013, there was a 50% decline in the Northeast population, which caused significant concern. So in 2013, the DNR closed the public hunt in the Northeast and designated the species as a species of special concern in the state. However, there is still a limited tribal harvest every year, just because that it's such a significant cultural species for the tribes, and also within the ceded territory, they do retain hunting rights. I should say, as you can see, there is, since that crash that ended in 2013, since then, the population seems to be relatively stable. Of course, that's a good thing. That's something that we hope continues. But it is something that we want to make sure we're understanding what is happening so that we can further stabilize the population. So in response to that decline, the Minnesota legislature directed DNR to put together a moose advisory committee. This committee was to make recommendations to the DNR to inform a moose research and management plan. So this group produced a detailed report with specific recommendations that they believed would contribute to better understanding of moose and the steps needed to reverse the population decline, if possible. So during their recommendation process, the Moose Advisory Committee identified this strategic vision that guided them. And moose have an intrinsic value and are recognized for their importance in Minnesota. To the greatest extent possible, moose shall be managed for ecological sustainability, hunting, and viewing opportunities. And so the outcome of their recommendations was the 2011 Minnesota Moose Research and Management Plan, which is the standing moose plan to date. So just to give me a break and get a drink of coffee here, thought I'd have a little quiz. You can just pop it in the chat. Is what is considered the cause of decline of moose in northeastern Minnesota? Curious what people have to say.
Rainworm, loss of habitat. Yep, more brainworm and habitat. Disease, wolves, predators, ticks, climate change.
Good.
Yeah, the answers are slowing down, but yeah, definitely brainworm and habitat loss seem to be the main Main ones, yeah. Some bears, cumulative issues, multiple issues.
Good. Yes. So yes, that is right. There is not one single cause of the population decline. Instead, there is a variety of overlapping and compounding issues. In northeastern Minnesota, we've always had wolves. They've always been present, and so wolf predation is considered the #1 cause of calf mortality, and so which is really impacting calf recruitment. However, parasites and disease are a significant cause of adult moose mortality. And so we have predation on calves, and then parasites and disease on adults. And then there is climate change, which, moose are large, dark-bodied animals, and they get hot. They have to, when they get hot, they have to find a spot to cool down. They have to thermoregulate efficiently. Otherwise, that is an additional stressor on their bodies. And so that's more studies are coming out that warming temperatures are having an impact on moose too, especially in Minnesota, because moose are at the southern end of their range in the state here. So yes, good job, everyone. So where does habitat fall into that? So while the moose management plan addressed all of those other things, and a lot of the studies that have been ongoing with moose are looking at parasites and deer interactions and predation and mortality. But in the habitat, or sorry, in the moose management plan, one of the objectives was also focused on habitat, and so that's to provide high quality habitat across moose range. So what does that mean? Well, moose are habitat generalists, meaning that they really use a wide variety of habitat types. They don't really require any specific or unique habitat. However, they do need 2 components of their habitat. One is forage, which is food, and then cover. So moose, the Anishinaabe word for moose is moose, which translates to twig eater, and that is largely their diet. It is a diverse mixture of deciduous shrub and tree species. They do, in the summer, feed on aquatic vegetation, but much more so, especially in Minnesota, that deciduous shrub and tree species make up a large proportion of their diet. They're a large animal. It takes a lot of twigs and leaves to sustain a 1,600-pound animal. And so these quality forage areas need to have a high density of twigs within the reach of animals. So generally less than 9 feet in height, that is, and that's available to them. So young regenerating forests do provide this abundant, high quality foraging opportunities. And a lot of these foraging areas are created through disturbances such as fire, timber harvesting, shearing, mechanical site prep, and any kind of disturbance that regenerates those deciduous species. So the other component is cover. And so cover is generally provided by mature closed canopy conifer forests or mixed forest with a high conifer component dominated by species that can intercept snow. And so functions of cover is predator avoidance and calving sites. So this was really found to be the case in Alaska, where moose have been observed to be much more cautious and stick closer to cover, especially where wolves are present, compared to moose that are closer to town where there's not that predator pressure. Then they are using more of out in the open a lot more often. So it's really, compare that to our situation in Northeast Minnesota here, where we have a fairly high number of predators. That predator avoidance and protected calving sites is really important. These closed canopy conifer stands provide cooler temperatures for better thermal regulation. They are able to get out of the sun, out of the heat, and lay in that nice cool duff and moss and cool down. And then snow interception. So moose are built for the cold, but late winter is really when moose are at their worst body condition. They've gone through a whole winter, they're feeding on twigs. And so when the snow is deep, it is a lot of energy that is that they have to use to get around. And so really getting into those conifer stands where there's less snow load is really helpful for them, especially in late winter, and particularly for pregnant cows when they don't really want to move very far from conifer cover and get out into that deep snow. So while forage abundance is really a significant driver in habitat use, we see moose are using disturbed areas, they're feeding there, they're being drawn to those areas. There is also that spatial relationship between forage and cover that influences moose use of their habitat. And so quality habitat really provides that mix of interspersed cover and forage that give individual animals easy access to the resources they need. If moose have to start making trade-offs, and so if they need to stop eating in order to get to move a long distance to cover where they can cool down or escape from the deep snow, then that trade-off can really end up affecting their overall body condition and makes them more susceptible to disease and predation and the other factors that are impacting them. So in Minnesota, especially Northeast Minnesota, one of the historically wildfire and indigenous burning practices really created that mosaic, that interspersion of cover and forage that really suited moose well. However, after a century of fire suppression in the state, we don't really have that tool available to us, especially at a large scale. And so really in commercial timber harvesting is really responsible, especially the last century, for the large majority of moose habitat management in Minnesota. So in the northeast part of the state, since moose habitat is achieved through commercial timber harvesting, we have an unfortunate situation where we really have poor timber markets. And that's really been ongoing for the last 20 years or so. We've had a handful of mill closures that have taken a significant amount of fiber from this area, with the most recent closure in 2021 with the closing of Verso. And so right now in this part of the state, we only have good markets for certain species and products. So aspen, we have a strong market for, and softwood bolts and saw logs. Other species that are common on the landscape, there isn't a good market for, which has really overall reduced harvesting across the landscape, across all ownerships. And that combination of reduced harvesting and fire suppression has left a really significant lack of disturbance on the landscape. And so this has resulted in an aging forest. In the logging boom, we had a lot of the spruce and fir, or I should say pine and spruce, taken off the landscape, harvested. A lot of conversion to these hardwood aspen birch types, and these fire-dependent forests, they don't age gracefully, and so once they get old, there's not a lot of the seed sources left to regenerate. A lot of these sites are really rich sites, so they have really heavy brush understories, which you would think would be good for moose. However, old decadent brush is not as nutritious as young regenerating stems, and so there isn't a lot of moose use in these stands when the brush gets old and decadent. So you have a stand that's declining, and as the canopy falls apart, that heavy brush component really prevents tree regeneration. There's not the seed source to seed in, but then there's also the lack of disturbance necessary to regenerate these tree species. Some additional evidence here is just a trend toward older forest is the extent of spruce butterum impacts in this area. While there's been ongoing defoliation for the last decade or more, in 2023, the outbreak impacted just under 665,000 acres, which is the highest amount since 1961. And so needless to say, as you can see on the map, we have large areas of dead and dying spruce and fir. So in response to the moose management plan with the objective of habitat and then also just the current forest conditions in the Northeast, in 2013, the Minnesota Moose Habitat Collaborative was formed. And so this collaborative is made of 10 organizations, and they're using Outdoor Heritage Fund money to find opportunities to do moose habitat enhancement work across northeastern Minnesota, across the Moose Range. So originally, the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association was the grant sponsor, and TNC, the Nature Conservancy, is the site project and public land administrator. They're the coordinator, and so there was 3 phases, and in the 4th phase, which is the current phase, the Rough Grouse Society took over for the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association. And so really this collaborative is, like I said, they're really trying to come up with opportunities to apply disturbance and to enhance habitat where they can. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what they've done. And so again, really good work trying to get disturbance back in the landscape, planting conifers for future cover for moose, restoring some of these fire dependent ecosystems. And they've been doing a lot of work, but it really has been fairly limited in scale on the landscape, just due to the fact that the landscape is so large, actually. So in the past 20 years, there have been several large wildfires in the Arrowhead, mostly occurring in the boundary waters. However, as the annual surveys were flown for survey the moose population, observers were noticing that there were significantly more moose in these large regenerating burn areas. And so really that started thinking about applying disturbance and looking for opportunities to do moose habitat enhancement at a larger scale. That is something that moose are responding to, and that we should start considering more. And so that is kind of what brought on this the project that I'm working on now. And so the Moose Habitat Planning Project is a grant-funded project. It is a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's America the Beautiful Challenge program. The title of the project is Collaborative Planning to Identify and Overcome Challenges Facing Large-Scale Moose Habitat Restoration in Northeastern Minnesota. So really, as DNR Fish and Wildlife was preparing to update their 2011 moose management plan, they kept going back to that, habitat is important. Habitat is important, and it needs to be done at a larger scale than what we're doing. But there are challenges to that. There's challenges to that that's been demonstrated by the Moose Habitat Collaborative, but then also just in other forest management objectives that we've been trying to do on the landscape. And so really the framing was that large-scale habitat management would be particularly beneficial to moose, yet there are challenges that need to be addressed with it. And so to do that, to address those challenges and to try to do some large-scale work, it will take bringing everyone to the table. And so the outcomes for this project are really outlining the challenges of doing the work. Why is it so difficult to do it? Why haven't we been able to do landscape level management yet? and then also an implementation plan to conduct coordinated treatments across ownerships on 3 large habitat project areas. So really try to identify some strategies to address those challenges, and then apply them on the landscape and see if we can get some large scale habitat work done. So the collaborating organizations are listed: tribal, county, state, federal, NGOs, and then Minnesota Forest Industries and University of Minnesota Duluth. It's really a great mix of forest managers and wildlife biologists. Wildlife biologists for the moose habitat piece of it, but then also forest managers, because that's when we're talking about the tools that we're using to do moose habitat work are also tools that we use for forest management. And so all these organizations that are involved really play a role in some form in moose or moose habitat management, including research, forest management, advocacy, and education. So this project is one of 55 chosen out of over 500 grant applications. It is just a collaborative planning grant. It's only for planning purposes. The program, America the Beautiful Challenge, has an implementation grant that's for on the ground work, but this is just for kind of setting the stage for that. The amount is approximately $440,000 in total, and that's with an in-kind match. And that funding is going to a dedicated project manager, which is myself, and then funding the project activities, which is a series of workshops, meetings, etc. And then also we're contracting with the Northern Research Station on some habitat modeling work that they're doing. So the first thing was really, what are the challenges facing this? And so we had every organization, every participant from the organizations come up with all the challenges that they face in doing anything that benefits moose habitat work. So you can see the combined list was 170 challenges from 12 organizations. It was a lot, but they all those specific challenges fit into one of these 5 categories. So coordination, political, public and organizational support, research, economics, operations, and environmental. So the first, coordination, really those differing laws, policies, timelines, priorities, and management plans held by all of the players on the landscape. When you look at the map, it's a patchwork of ownership, and it's hard to coordinate with each other. It's hard to coordinate management activities across the ownerships. It's hard to coordinate management activities in the same general vicinity at the same time. Sometimes we're, kind of in our own silos doing our own things. And that is really because we have such differing laws and policies and plans that we're following. And so different ways of doing business, different timelines for approval processes, for planning, different priorities that we have in what we're trying to do, different objectives on the landscape. So when things get difficult, a lot of times, that piece of it gets put on the back burner, and we end up just doing our own thing. Economics and operations. Poor salability and viability of harvesting activities, unpredictability of non-harvest treatment completion, prescribed fire implementation, and then funding. And so really it's that cascading effect of poor timber markets. There's no demand for many of the species and products that are on the landscape. That has led to a decreased number of logging operations. So we have really limited capacity in logging operations. And a lot of these sites have difficult access, they're low volume and low merchantability. And so really we have a limited, our most efficient tool in timber harvesting is limited in this area. And so these, there it is. So if we can't do timber harvesting, we have to go to non-harvest treatments. And this includes mechanical site prep, other different kinds of shearing and brush saw work. But there's really few remaining contractors doing this heavy equipment work. It's a high cost of fuel and equipment. Nobody's really getting into that business. An issue that there's a lot of residual material left on site when you're doing this. When there's timber harvesting, a lot of that material is removed, and so you don't have to deal with it. All this work is really labor intensive. And then there's issues with seed and seedling availability for doing large scale things at once. So challenges with prescribed fire implementation, it's really difficult to safely pull off these stand replacing fires in timber types. There's a high cost to prep treatments because of that high fuel loading. And, when conditions are good to burn, usually fire danger is high. The Forest Service and the DNR both have fire suppression responsibilities, and so that can take away resources when we have limited burn windows. So all of these things kind of point to that we need funding. We need funding to do this work. However, there's complexity in that. How do you share funding within and among partners to complete projects? How do you make sure that you have the funding when you have the project ready to go? So you don't want to drown yourself in money to not be able to get projects off the ground. And then there's that organization capacity and expertise in how to manage funds and grant requirements. So it's public, political, and organizational support. So it has inadequate public support, inadequate political support, and inadequate organizational support. Inadequate does not necessarily mean that there's no support for moose. It's really that it's not enough to overcome the challenges. And so really, when we talk about moose habitat treatment tools and treatments to do moose habitat work, timber harvesting, people don't necessarily always like the idea of large clear cuts or a lot of timber harvesting. Prescribed fire can be really scary to the public, and a liability too. And so there's all of these things that there's little education or little information on connecting the moose habitat work or the treatments and the tools to the animal. And so people like moose, there's a lot of support for moose on the landscape, but how we get the habitat, how we manage the habitat, there's a lack there in education. And as far as organizational support, limited staff capacity. Moose aren't always a priority compared to other landscape goals and sometimes other species on the landscape. And there really is that, that lack of funding for non-commercial treatments when it's not connected to a market or when there's not a commercially viable way to do that. And then there's for different ownerships, there's a reluctance to conduct prescribed burns on their ownership. The research piece of it is there has been ongoing research and surveys, looking at moose, looking at different factors of moose mortality and impacts that influences, on moose. But there's really very little work that's been done in Minnesota, especially about how moose use their habitat. That what is a good spatial arrangement of cover and forage? How much forage is necessary to really sustain a population, and what does that look like? And then environmental. There's just a lot of unknowns about forest insects and disease, different forest pests, invasives that could come along, moose biological factors. If we build it, they will come, but will they stay? That the idea are they just going to keep migrating north and they won't be in Minnesota any longer? There's really a lot of unknowns we don't really know. So once we have the challenges down, one of the things that we addressed in this project was really identifying some strategies to look at those high impact challenges. And so we kind of have some strategies in line, strategies that we're going to apply in planning, in the planning phase, I should say, strategies we're going to apply in the implementation phase, and then strategies for long-term sustainability of this work. So some of the strategies that we're applying in planning is, really developing that desired moose habitat configuration guidelines and habitat considerations. So we know we're all on the same page about what that looks like, what we're trying to do. There are a lot of unknowns. We need to do more research, but based on existing literature, based on local expertise, let's develop those so that we can have kind of a map of where we're trying to get to. To do this work, we want to build off existing opportunities. That capacity piece. We have limited staff capacity. We have limited operational capacity in loggers and contractors. And so we want to make sure that we can identify what's going on right now and see if we can build off of that to improve moose habitat. And we want to seek out those co-benefits, linking moose habitat work to other organization priorities, building off of those opportunities, seeing if we can use what other work is going on out there to improve habitat. And then identify research and monitoring needs. That's to make sure that we're using this opportunity to learn more, to get that information that we're lacking right now, to see if what we're doing is successful. And then identify funding needs and potential sources of funding. That's, again, since our most efficient tool of commercial timber harvesting is fairly limited, we're going to need funding. And then really develop a communication plan to start making those connections and educating and informing the public and elected officials about the habitat treatments and the animal. So the second part of this project is really identifying these 10 to 50,000 acre habitat project areas. These are, really big areas, and what we're trying to do in these areas is implement treatments such as prescribed fire, timber harvesting, mechanical site prep, shearing, tree planting. We're trying to find opportunities to do this work at a large scale, so across ownerships. And it really is an opportunity to apply some strategies that we have identified, really strengthen those partnerships, and get other work done at the same time, and then also inform future work through that monitoring aspect to inform what more we could do, or should we be doing something different. So what we're trying to do in these areas is really to mimic the effects of these large fire regimes. And so these large complexes of diverse, high quality forage intermixed with winter and summer cover. So creating these large patches where there's interspersion yet of cover, and making that available spatially. So we did also put together, what does this look like on the landscape? It's one thing to say, this is what we're trying to do, but how does that look, and how can we see if we accomplish what we're trying to do? And so this is what we're attempting to do in these areas. This target proportion here, this 8,000 acres, that's really based on a average moose home range. And so we have to really start there in order to kind of delineate or apply what would be good for moose. And so kind of a standard 8,000 acres, this is what ideally we're trying to do. So create, within 5 to 10 years, create forage, so disturb about 20 to 50% of the area. This is a really large proportion. 50% of an area of 8,000 acres is a lot, especially given our challenges. However, what we've been seeing, or what the observers have been seeing in these large burn areas, is these moose are using these really, really large areas of forage. And so if we can get to that, that will be a really good test to see if we can do that. However, there's going to be limitations on the landscape for sure. And so that's, we have this minimum and maximum range really to make sure that we can consider those constraints. And then cover, this 25 to 30% cover is really, cover is existing cover, and so we're trying to make sure we reserve that, and we reserve it in a spatial configuration where it is intermixed. But then we can also look at an area and say, if we're lacking in that existing cover, then that would be a good place to start planting conifers to plan for future cover. So we, where in the landscape can we do this? And so we identified some criteria that we wanted to apply in order to tease out where we wanted to do this on the landscape. The main thing here is that we wanted to have mixed ownership in order to maximize those partnerships. The point of this project is to really develop those relationships and work together. And we wanted various jurisdictions, so different Forest Service ranger districts, different DNR forestry areas, different counties, and that's to maximize those partnerships, but also to spread the workload a little bit and spread the capacity. And then, of course, we really wanted manageable land. And so this is these are the 3 areas that we have identified moving into this, through this planning phase. And so what we did is put together project working groups for each area. It's made up of local staff from different organizations, and they're really looking at where are good opportunities to do this work. So here are our final treatment units. So based on the target proportions that we laid out, we tried to really pick again areas that we're building off of existing opportunities, and where we can really seek those co-benefits. And so finding areas that the Forest Service already had NEPA approved, work to do, already have planned prescribed burns or planned timber harvesting, finding areas where there's a need to do management, where there's spruce budworm that needs to be treated. We can treat those areas and then improve moose habitat at the same time. So kind of making sure that we're maximizing those co-benefits so that we can keep moose high up on the priority list. And so it actually worked out really well. The Forest Service has done a really great job the last cycles of NEPA to identify these kind of big patch areas where they have a lot of work planned. And so starting with them, kind of the limiting factor, because they do have a lot of red tape that they have to go through. So identifying those areas and then building on state and county from there. And so we are currently still in this planning process, working through this part of it. And so we should be done with this plan by the end of February. But, and once the plan is done, then we're going to immediately move into implementation. So one of the ideas of identifying these areas where there's already work planned and in some cases already work starting to be done or being done, it's really to not have a lag between the planning and the implementation. We want to make sure to be able to keep the momentum and get right into getting work done on the ground. Sometimes, we get stuck in talking a lot, and then if there's a lag and we don't see work being done, or there's not that push to start doing it, then sometimes again that kind of gets shelved, and we go about doing business as usual. And so so the intent is to move right into implementation. So some of the strategies that we're applying in implementation is we're going to plan and coordinate these treatments, package timber sales, coordinate non-harvest treatments, identify timing of treatments on ownership so we can coordinate that, and that will also help inform funding needs. Develop the integrated research and monitoring program. Identify what new resources are needed, if funding, and then a project manager or a point person in implementation, and then really promote that moose-related messaging aligned across organizations. Some of the strategies for long-term sustainability is continue to obtain funding for the work, for research and monitoring. That's going to really go into the future. Invest in roads and infrastructure for improved access for these treatments. That'll help with salability. It'll help with getting out, onto these sites to do the work. Building support from local and state elected officials and agencies for doing the moose habitat work and treatments and the tools needed. And then also, to advocate for new and diverse timber market development. That having the key diverse market development is really important to really build that capacity for doing this work at a scale that is really efficient, which is using timber harvesting. So I did want to leave time for questions. It's a big project, and it's always a little bit better seeing what people have or what questions they have, and then building off of there. So Lane, does anybody have any questions?
Yes, we have many questions in chat. So we have an embarrassment of riches here. So the first one, and I think this is kind of a fun one. If you had magical powers, Megan, would you reduce wolf numbers in Minnesota moose habitat? Maybe that's a loaded question there. No, people are attached to their wolves.
It is a loaded question. I am a forester, and this project is about habitat. And so that is, there are different factors. And so that is one thing that we don't know if doing more for habitat is going to be a magic bullet. We don't know that there are other things, including wolves, but there's also all of the other factors. And so the big thing is, though, that we can do something with habitat. We have the capacity, we have the knowledge to do forest management for habitat. And so that's one thing that we should do that can, even if it doesn't necessarily have make the moose numbers rebound all the way up to what they were at their highest, it could at least, it could be a stabilizing factor.
Sure. Thanks. And then another one here related to non-bid timber tracts. Have sales been offered with a near zero appraisal to achieve some type of harvest or regeneration opportunities compared to the more expensive regeneration alternatives?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of this leads into the different ways that we do business and the different policies and laws that we have to follow. And so there are certain organizations that are a little more, that are easier to be flexible in the way that they package treatments and the way that they can do things. Like the counties are quite a bit more flexible in how they can do that. The Forest Service and the DNR, the state, have a longer road ahead of them. There is that desire to figure out, how do we use this tool that we have available to us? How do we use that to get the work done in an efficient way? And so we're working through some of that right now. But there is work being done there, but there is for sure more exploring of that strategy.
Sure. And then just a quick question here related to the moose surveys. Are they still done in Northwest Minnesota, or are they mostly just in North Central and Northeast Minnesota?
Yes, so they are no longer. So 2007 was the last time that they did a moose survey in Northwest Minnesota. And that's really just because the population was so small, they couldn't estimate anything. It wasn't worth flying. And so right now, only the northeastern part of the state is flown for the survey.
Okay. And then is there any research into what Western states are doing? So moose populations with a lack of timber markets there as well. So maybe some parallels?
Yeah, so there's a lot of parallels. So there's very different. So there's moose, in the northeast part of the country. So Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. They have a really high moose density, moose population. They have different issues though. They don't have any wolves, they don't have predation, but they are overwhelmed with winter ticks. And so the biggest cause of mortality in the Northeast is winter ticks, is really just, that the parasite that just depletes all of their, just really destroys their body condition. And so there's quite an active forest management program over in those states. And so again, habitat isn't necessarily seen as an issue. There's no predators. It really is that winter tick. In the western part of the country, it's interesting because moose are actually expanding southward into Utah and portions of Nevada. And so they use quite a bit different habitat there than they do here. They have elevation. And so, when they need to cool down or thermoregulate, they use elevation to do that. They have a lot of kind of scrub oak in their landscape, and the moose use that quite a bit. And so it's just a different kind of issues that they're dealing with over there. And they also have a large, mule deer population, elk population. So there's a lot of competition for habitat and resources over there. And so really the closest thing that we can compare to our population is Ontario. And so they're kind of in the same situation where they have predation, wolves. They have a very active forest management program, but they have a really their landscape is much more heavy to conifer, and so they have much more of a focus on in their areas where they're trying to manage for moose. They want to push more for having some hardwoods out there. So it is it's moose are tricky because there's not really good parallels all over.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly complex. We have another question there actually on the topic of the ticks. How damaging are they? And maybe you touched on that a little bit, but then can anything be done through habitat management to reduce those?
Yeah, so ticks are again just one more thing that's impacting moose. Not something that's rising to the top by any means in Minnesota, but definitely there is some studies that are starting to suggest that habitat management, especially through fire, but also through timber harvesting and disturbance, other disturbance, mechanical disturbance, can reduce winter tick populations, and also, let me get this right, parasite host populations. And so one thing that's very strange that I find very strange is that parasites, brainworm, are transmitted from deer to snails, and then the moose eat the snails, and then they ingest and have the parasite. When they have these surveys of these gastropods or these snails, they very, very, very rarely find brainworm in them. But deer are overwhelmingly infested with the parasite. And so what the mechanism is unknown on how moose, they only have to eat one, I guess, to have the parasite, but just very interesting that even if there's limited interaction, that transmission is so swift, even though the gastropod infestation or infection rate is low. So really the habitat treatments though can reduce the parasite number, or sorry, the snail numbers, potentially would help with that transmission.
Thank you. We have just a comment from it sounds like maybe someone north of the border here. Some of my colleagues are leading the way for prescribed burning locally, also with moose as one of the values. And there's a link there. And could be a resource through a different ecosystem, and that fits really neatly as far as actually applying prescribed burning and some of the challenges associated with that. We do have a webinar a little under a year from now here scheduled in November to kind of unpack some of the practitioner side of prescribed burning and some of the constraints there. So stay tuned for that, but there will be more. I'll mention that more than once over the next several months here. And I also, just real quick here, before I get back to a lot of questions, I don't know if we'll get to all of them. I did paste a link in the chat for the CE form. So if you're interested in that, make sure you click on that here. I'll paste that again in a moment. So a question here from Tim, do we know what mill consumption capacity is? Do we know what harvesting capacity is for current logging companies? And what markets are available to consume the types of forest products that need to be harvested? So a threefer.
Yeah, that's a good question, Tim. I don't know. We do have the DNR has a utilization and marketing program, and so that might be something strategy. To really lay that out, find out what that is, and so we can really understand, what's needed and where. But that's a good question. I don't know if a lot of work has gone into that yet, but hopefully, if we get enough, we kind of create that laundry list of these are the things that are being impacted by not having by being limited on our timber harvesting. Maybe there could be a bigger push just across organizations, kind of a more coordinated effort to dig into that and make them move.
Sure. Sorry for the distraction there on my end. Small child running around. What are some strategies to develop this desired habitat on private lands? We touched a bit on the markets just now.
Yeah, that's one thing that's come up in this project too is reaching out and there's, I think in the moose range there it's 80% plus public land, but there are private land in holdings, and so there is and I know that is something that a lot of private landowners in the moose range, they want to see moose, they want to have them there, and so getting that information out to them, whether that's through consultants or their stewardship plan, forest stewardship plan program, that would be a good way to get that information out and start making that connection between the animal and the habitat management.
Sure. Well, there's still some questions here, but I'm afraid we'll have to call it here. We're coming up on 10 a.m. Thanks so much, Megan, for your presentation. This has been great. And again, an embarrassment of riches here with lots of questions in chat. Sorry we can't get to them. If you'd like, I can paste your email if you want, if that's okay, if you want folks to follow up. So if folks with questions in chat, if you stick around for a moment, I'll paste that email. I've also pasted Megan's email. I've also pasted the link for CEs in this chat. And then I also just once more want to bump the announcement, our January 8th Research and Practice Review 2025, Cloquet Forestry Center. We'd love to see y'all there. And then there will be more communications too for our 2025 webinar series. So thanks again, Megan.